So a component like this might seem a bit overwhelming at first, but if we break it down to its separate elements, it'll make it a lot easier. So first off, we've got this sort of hinge mechanism, and then we've got this top swing arm in the blue, and then lastly we've got these sort of bucket shaped holsters that hold the spring and the shock. And the good thing with these is they're mirrored, so we only have to make one side and then mirror it across. So you can see in the background I've already started building this hinge part. So starting with a box and a cylinder, and just snapping the cylinder's center to the top right of that box. And then I'm just scaling it back to sort of 1/3 of the length of that rectangle. And when I'm happy with that, I'm going to duplicate it across to the other side and flip it around. And then we've got a pretty good starting point for our hinge. So next I've just attached all those three objects together. And you can see when I made those cylinders, I put the end caps on. That way I can extrude those ends, and I can extrude both together at the same time. And because we spun the cylinder around, it'll pull both of those end caps outwards. This gives us those little sort of pins that are sticking out the side of the hinge. So next I'm going to select the box component, select its faces and sort of cut in some more geometry, just using the good old slice plane. So snapping it to the vertices of that cylinder, just to make welding the vertices together a bit easier later on. And then selecting some of the faces of the cylinder and pulling them off using shift move, and pulling them off as a part of the element. And then you can see here I accidentally deleted some faces I probably shouldn't have, so I was just copying some of them back in. And then we can use target weld to weld the sort of inside of that hinge that we just made, those three extra faces. We'll weld them to the edge of the cylinder. And there we have it. That's the sort of first component of this whole suspension assembly made. So now we're going to work on the top swing arm. So starting with a cylinder, I can align that to the object that we just made, and then making sure that the center point of this new cylinder is in line with the other ones. And then we might want to scale it down just a little bit, just so it looks like it could rotate within that hinge. And then next we're just going to make a box and a cylinder, and snap the cylinder to the end of the box. And then having the end caps on, we're going to delete them so we get like a ring shape. Now we won't have any faces on the inside of that ring, so we'll just select all the edges, top and bottom, and then with one click of the bridge tool we should build a group of faces all at once between those two tops and bottoms of the cylinder. And that sort of gives us this sort of spanner shape once we delete those, sort of half of that cylinder. That's sort of like the horseshoe shape that we're going for. And then I've just sped this next section up because we're just going to move some vertices around. You can see I actually deleted the rectangle that I started with, and then just extruded the back faces of that cylinder to make up the box. Now I've sped this section up because Max actually crashed on me while I was working on it, so I've actually built this piece twice. But you see the next step was creating more cylinders, putting them on the ends, and then subdividing them, cutting the faces, and then welding it all together. And then lastly, I could see that the swing arm has like a sort of edge around it. So I cut in some more geometry and then use the extrude tool to sort of extrude that lip out. So unfortunately here, just when I was finished and just started to smooth it out, Max crashed on me and I hadn't saved it, so I had to rebuild this piece. And I actually think the second time I built it was better anyway. So it was just a bit annoying. So always save your work. You can see here I'm attaching it into the cylinder that we started with. Just lining up all the sort of subdivisions in the square part of the swing arm with the cylinder so that we can get some nice bridges of geometry. So yeah, I was just happy with that. I was literally seconds away from saving and crash. Alright, so here's the alternate way I built this swing arm. So I started with two cylinders and then was playing around with the boolean command. So the boolean lets you choose two objects and you can create a new object based on those two. So you can merge two together, or you can use what we're doing here, which is the subtract method. So one shape will get cut out of the other shape. So it's a little bit tricky to get the right combination you're after. But you basically just choose the two shapes and then choose the type of Boolean operation you want to do. It's not super commonly used, but it is handy every now and then. So once we've got this sort of horseshoe shape, like we did before, this time I've actually added the chamfer to that edge first, and then cut in some uh, uh, geometry, and then extruded that out to give that sort of bevel on the edge. So I think this is a more efficient way to build this, and you can see I've got my rectangle, that sort of light blue coloured piece. That was the same idea. We created a box, put in some subdivisions, and then extruded the lower ones out to give that sort of lip. And now we're working on the cylinder ends of that sort of horseshoe shape. And I did these the same as I did the first way. So get the rough shape and then subdivide and push the vertices to the edges, and then deleting the right amount of faces that'll match up with the edges of the neighbouring shape that we're going to weld together. And you can see this time I left a gap between all the objects and then used the bridge tool. And I think this gives a better join between those pieces. Now we're just cleaning up our geometry, just making sure we clean up any triangles and get a nicer sort of flow of subdivisions through these shapes. And again, using the target weld tool just to clean up any stray vertices. So you can see using just a handful of tools repeatedly, again and again, like the um, bevel, extrude, and target weld tools, you can build quite a lot of shapes. So in the top view here, I've just sort of selected all the vertices that I want in a line, and then use the align tool, well, not the align tool, but the make planar XYZ tools to line them up, and then just rotating them with rotation snaps on. When I was happy with one side, I ended up just selecting all the faces and cutting it and pulling it off, and then putting it to the other side, welding it back together. Ideally, I probably should have just created half of this and mirrored it across. You always think of those things once you've built it. So you can see here I didn't need that subdivision right in the middle of that straight section of the swing arm, so I moved it to the end, and that gave me more geometry to put in a sort of smoother curve. So now just subdividing this end cylinder that goes into the hinge using the split face or plane tool, and then deleting out those faces, and then this time I just target welded those vertices. And you can see the results here weren't great. I think it worked better before when I left that gap and then bridged new faces in. So I cleaned this up by selecting those faces that looked like they were a little bit twisted and just cutting in more subdivisions. And I didn't want that sort of extruded edge to run all the way into the hinge casting, so you can see here I just sort of made up that it ends just before the cylinder part. And that's pretty much the finished shape. So then we're snapping it to the hinge and keeping the pivot of this entire object right on the end cylinder hinge point, so that when we rotate it, it looks like it's part of that hinge and not rotating from anywhere it shouldn't. So next I'm just adding in some extra detail that I spotted on this hinge. There's these four little support brackets. They were pretty easy to make. It's just a box, and then converting it to edit poly and moving the vertices, using the snapping to keep them on the same plane as the edge of that cylinder. And then once I'm happy with them on one side, just moving them across. And then making sure to attach them all together so that it's one component. And because we're building this from reference photos and we don't have that much of a real world scale to work on, you'll see I'll constantly be tweaking the scale of these components, moving them around so that it looks about right. So looking in the top down view, that big cylinder in the background is the placeholder piece we've got for our axle. So that's about the diameter of the hole that's going to get punched through the chassis rails. So this swing arm needs to be sort of thick enough to support all that metal. So I'm scaling it up now to make it look a bit more like the real world scale it should be. Just be careful when you scale that you don't squash your shape, because we don't want those cylinders on the ends to become oval shaped. Alright, so moving along, we're going to work on these sort of bucket shaped things. So starting with a cylinder, I like to use 12 sides. 8 is a little bit too low poly, and then anything higher than 12 is probably a bit too much geometry to be working with early on. You can always subdivide this down or mesh smooth it out later. So same processes we've been using before. um, flattening down one side of it, and then using the chamfer tool to smooth out that sort of top edge, and then using the slice plane to add in some more geometry to slice off that bottom side. And then you can see here I'm just pulling up the vertices to um, give that sort of cutout shape, and then subdividing down the middle and horizontally across the sides, just to give me something to sort of work to add in some more subdivisions to smooth all this out and get a better flow of geometry. And then flipping around to the underside and making sure that that internal shape is cylinder, because that's going to be where the top of the spring coil and shock absorber go into. And then again, slice plane, just making sure we don't have any triangles here. And we could mesh smooth this shape out if we wanted to, but I think this level of detail is going to be fine when we come to rendering this out. And again, this piece has a sort of lip around it, so I'm just selecting the edge faces and extruding them out. And then once we're happy with that, we can sort of place it in the side camera and then mirror it across the axle cylinder that we've got there as our placeholder, and then attach both those shapes together so that they're one component. You can see here when I duplicated that one across, I did it as an instance so that I could keep tweaking the first one and the changes would copy across to the second. Now I'm just working on that sort of top shape, which is simply just a cylinder, and then rather than slice it in half, I just use the option when you create a cylinder to start it at 0 and only go to 180, and that gives you that half cylinder shape. And then once it's converted to an edit poly, just deleting the underside of that, and then I can use the bridge tool to weld all that together to actually make it part of the top of the first object we created. And this, again, isn't super necessary, but I think it'll be better when it comes to if we did smooth this out, or even when we come to UV laying, doing our UVs on this object. It's easier if they're one component made out of one mesh as opposed to a bunch of objects all stacked on top of each other. Alright, so next we've got this lower swing arm, and it's kind of like a butterfly shape. So it is symmetrical, which will make it easier to model. It's got that same lip around the edge, and it's got those sort of semicircle points where the shock tower attaches to it. Alright, so the way I started this was with 3 cylinders. I started with one 12-sided and then just shift dragged to duplicate it 3 times, and then changing it to selecting all of them and converting them to an edit poly. I then chose the top and bottom caps of the cylinders and removed them, and that sort of gave me the sort of rough framework to work with. If you can see in this top view, I've got the sort of top 2 curves, and then working the top view using the edge tool, I've just selected the edges and I'm dragging them out, holding down shift to extrude new faces. And then selecting all those sort of inner circle ones and dragging them across as a copy, and then switching to vertice mode and pulling them across. And just checking it in perspective, making sure it's all looking correct, and then using the align or make planar XYZ to make sure all those vertices are the same height. And then we've bridged all those edges together. I can simply select the shape and hit cap and that'll make a face top and bottom. And then I thought, it's probably easier just to work on half of this side. So I split it down the middle, and you'll see in a minute I'll delete half of it and come back to that later. So to punch out that hole in the middle, you choose the Boolean command again. So creating a cylinder for the size of the hole, and then adding the two components together and choosing subtract. Sometimes it's a bit of playing around to get the right sort of combination of components, selecting them in the right order, and then using the right operand to get what you're after. But yeah, the more you use that tool, the easier it is. So now I'm using the cut geometry tool just to sort of cut in some better flows of geometry. You can see here I've got nice four-sided faces. Not too happy with that last one, but I'll come back and fix that up later. And then I could do that again to the underside, but it's easier just to select all the top faces I just created and pull them off. So I actually deleted all the sides, and then having this one flat piece of geometry, I'm then extruding that to get a three-dimensional shape. And now creating a cylinder and snapping it to the edge of the geometry. These are going to be the parts that connect into the hinge mechanism back on the chassis. So now I'm slicing a horizontal plane through that first butterfly shape we made. I'm doing that before I attach these end cylinders on. So now that those end cylinders are attached, very similar to how we did the top swing arm, just deleting the faces we don't need and pushing the vertices close enough, and then just using the bridge tool. You can see I tried to select the entire edge of both shapes and use the bridge command, but there's a bit of twisting happening, so and then I just realized I should add the chamfer to this shape before attaching it to the cylinders. It would just be easier to do it that way. And then just taking care of any little triangle edges that the chamfer tool introduced. And I wasn't too happy how I did that geometry, so I've just corrected those five-sided faces and got some better flow going through that shape. So then rather than chamfer on both edges, I just deleted the lower half and mirrored it across. Again, watching this back, there's probably quicker ways to do it, but every time we build something we get faster at it. So I rotated that cylinder with angle snapping on just to get a nice sort of flat edge to the side that is attaching to the butterfly shape. And you can see here I'm just using the bridge tool to bridge those two top and bottom pieces of that butterfly together. And just attaching the other cylinder on the other end. Once I'm pretty happy with that, I'm just going to mirror it across and then attach the two objects and target weld them together, or push them close enough together and just use the weld tool. So now I'm just playing with the smoothing to make that not look so hard-edged. And just looking back at my reference, I could see that the edges of this were actually quite a lot smoother than the way I modeled it, and doesn't really have that lip like the reference photo has. So just using the scale tool and selecting the edges, pulling them out to give more of a rounding to that shape. Alright, so looking in the top view, I could see this was not 100% correct. And I could have just modified one side and mirrored it across, which is what I end up doing. But yeah, it's just a matter of referring to the reference images and just pushing vertices around. This is probably a good level of detail to work on because it's not too hard to, it's not too many faces to reattach if we do chop things off or want to add in more detail. And just cleaning up the junction around that cylinder. Alright, so that's looking pretty good. I'm pretty happy with that. The next component we want to work on is the part that fills in those big holes that we've got in our butterfly shape. And that's simply a matter of creating a cylinder and then a bunch of other cylinders for the sort of nuts, and then we'll add a half circle to the top to be the connection point, similar to what we had on the other swing arm. So you can see we've got a 12-sided cylinder, and then using the inset tool and the extrude tool, we're just cutting in some more geometry. And then this is a cylinder for that sort of nut, and I can see there's 8 of these, so just selecting them in a pair and using the rotate tool and holding shift to make a copy, and rotating them with the angle snap on and even them out. And then flipping it over and attaching it to the correct spot. So using the move tool with vertices snapping on allows us to select the center point of that sort of hinge piece, and then I'm just adding in those sort of top connection points. I actually grab them off the other shock tower and just pull them off as a separate object, and then position them sort of in the place that I wanted them to attach to this butterfly piece, and then working on them as a separate object until I was happy with their placement, and then attached them both together and use the bridge tool to connect all those faces together. You can see I'm just cutting in some geometry into that half cylinder shape to allow it to connect better to my cylinder. And then just using the target weld tool to connect those faces. So we duplicated that top hinge down to the bottom. It's pretty much the same sort of piece. The only thing is I'm just scaling it up a little bit and putting in some extrusions to make that sort of pin element that goes through. Now we're working on the very last piece, the sort of cup shape that holds the coil of the spring and the shock absorber inside. So simply another 12-sided cylinder, and using the inset and extrude command, Again, we're just cutting in a bit more geometry on this half cylinder, putting a chamfer on the edge of it, and then attaching the two pieces together. And then we've got the chamfer tool on just to give that a bit of a smoother look. So to create the coil, we're going to use a spline with geometry turned on, and just make sure we've got generate UVs selected. And we're not going to convert this to an editable poly or anything. We want to keep it as a spline, because that way when it comes to rigging this, we can still use the height parameter to make the coil squash and extend as the shock absorber goes up and down. If we were to convert this to an editable poly, it'd be harder to rig later on, because we can't just scale it up and down, because that wouldn't give a realistic spring look. So lastly, I'm just selecting all these components that we've made and making sure they're in the correct location. I'm keeping everything sort of flat, even though in the finished model these will be on a bit of an angle leaning out to the wheels. But I think until we've done the UVs on this, we'll keep the model unsort of posed. Similar, if we were to build a human, we'd build it in a T-pose and then rig it, and then we can pose it with its arms down. So I still wasn't quite happy with this shape. You can see I got a bit of mess happening with the edge vertices, so just using the make planar tool and then rotating those vertices back out. And you can see I'm just working on half of it, and then I'll mirror it across and connect it. Alright, so the last piece of this sort of shock tower was to just use the inset tool and then extrude up to create that sort of internal shock. This probably won't be seen too much, so I wasn't too worried about putting too much detail into this or thinking too hard about how it'll be rigged up. I think for now that'll be good enough. And now looking in the front view, I've just sped this up. I can see that the swing arms weren't quite long enough to reach the wheel, so I've just scaled it up and just sort of fattening it all up, making it look a bit more heavy duty, and just cleaning up a little bit of the geometry problems that I had here with that cylinder attaching. You can see now, scaling the whole thing up as a group, you could get it to reach. Now this last component is like the wheel hub, and I didn't want to put too much detail into it because it will be behind the wheel, but we kind of need a piece of geometry here to attach the wheel to and attach the swing arms to. So it was quite necessary. And you can see I just made it out of a basic cube with some subdivisions and then extruded them out just to get the basic shape. I didn't put a great deal of detail into it, and when we come to do the normal maps on this, it'll probably be covered in grease and dirt anyway, so I was quite happy with that. You can see here I'm just adding in some pins to make it look like that's all attached properly. And then referring back to the front image plane, you can see that this lines up a lot better with our reference. One thing I did along the way was I widened up the chassis rails. They were looking a bit too skinny, and it made the hinge pieces that we made at the start have a bit more substance to attach to. Now, taking a closer look at these helixes for the springs, you can see I'm just moving that up so that it sits inside that sort of purple cup shape, and then you can see as we move the height parameter, it squashes that spring down without sort of scaling the vertices. So next we just want to make sure all the components have the same orientation. So I just rotated their pivots so that you can select them all and rotate them on the same axis, and they all move up and down together like they would in real life. And we're going to leave it modeled um, with the swing arm sort of out horizontally. I think when we finalize this model, they'll be on a bit of an angle. But for now, we'll make sure that we have angle snap on whenever we rotate these so that we can snap them back to the flat position if we need to edit the geometry for any reason. But you can sort of see here I'm expecting them to sit more like that when their model's final, and then that little shock tower will sit attached to that lower swing arm on a bit of an angle up into that sort of bucket shape. In the same colour will allow us to sort of identify them as their own group of objects without actually grouping them. And it's probably a good idea to clean up the layers. You could put all of these in their own sort of suspension layer. And then I just attached a cylinder to that wheel hub to be the disc of the brake. And now using the Boolean tool, I'm actually cutting the holes into those chassis rails using those cylinders that we had as a guide. And the next step would be to create the axles that run through that. But I think we'll leave it there because this video is getting a bit long. But there's our finished model. I duplicated each of those wheel assemblies as an instance so we can keep modifying it if we need to. But pretty happy with that, and it's starting to look like a real vehicle. So thanks for watching. If you've got any questions or comments, leave them below, and I'll see you in the next one.